Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Baker Institute. Tonight it is a distinct honor for me to introduce tonight's speaker, a man who played pivotal roles in the peaceful end of the Cold War and the emergence of Russia after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Born in Brussels when his father was working there as a Soviet engineer, he was educated at the Moscow State Institute of International Relations, where he earned a degree in history. He then joined the Soviet Ministry of Foreign Affairs and gained a reputation as someone who was quite savvy about the United Nations and about arms control. The young diplomat quickly rose up the bureaucratic ladder, and by 1988 he was a key right hand to Soviet Foreign Minister Eduard Shevardnadze, with whom I worked closely and productively when I was Secretary of State. Like Shevardnadze, he shared the passion for glasnost and reform of the Soviet system that Mikhail Gorbachev was spreading across the empire. In 1989, he gained international attention when he penned an article repudiating the international class struggle. Remember now, the international class struggle was at the very heart of Leninism, which in turn was the foundation of Soviet communism. By that time, his thoughts had been profoundly shaped by his first trip to New York City years earlier as a junior member of his country's delegation to the United Nations General Assembly. His belief in communism was shaken when he realized that ordinary Americans, and not just fat cat capitalists, owned cars and shopped in well-stocked supermarkets. His somewhat privileged Soviet family lived a life that was more akin to that of lower middle-class Americans. After the failed Soviet coup attempt of 1991, he became the Russian Federation's foreign minister at the ripe old age of 39, and was able to gain and keep the confidence of Soviet President Boris Yeltsin as that former Soviet republic, the Russian Federation, became an independent country. As foreign minister, he pushed for Russia to be a partner with the West, while also insisting that his country be treated as a great power rather than as a fallen superpower, viewed by many as one of his country's most important voices for liberalism and democracy in a post-Cold War world. He favored and worked hard to achieve major arms control agreements with the United States. I was fortunate to have worked closely with him when I was Secretary of State. I always found him to be an honest broker who understood how the arc of history was changing his homeland. Since being forced out as foreign minister in 1996 by opponents who found him too Western, he has been involved in business, public speaking, and writing. He now lives in Miami, where he remains focused on democratic change around the world. The foreign minister will be interviewed tonight by Ambassador Edward Djerejian, the founding director of the Baker Institute. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome a man who helped to make the world safer and more secure for all of us, the Honorable Andrei Kozyrev, the first foreign minister of a post-communist Russia.
Excellency, we'll begin our discussion, and then there'll be some written cues and questions from the audience, and then we'll have your book available here for anyone who wishes to purchase the book. The minister will be happy to sign it. So, you refer to your book, in your book, Secretary Baker's 1991 speech at Princeton, where he warned against the dark forces that threatened Russia's path toward democratization. In your view, what aspects of Russia's government and society made democratization so difficult?
KGB. But not that KGB that we once formed, you know, it was Genscher, Dietrich Genscher, who was then the foreign minister of Germany. At that time, it was already United Germany. We were working on a document or some arrangements to allow former Soviet, now Russian, nuclear scientists to have productive scientific research and life in cooperation with the West, rather than making atomic bombs, which they used to do in the Soviet Union. So that was the idea, to give them a benign, so to say, field to apply their fantastic knowledge and talent. So Genscher called it KGB, that is Kozyrev, Genscher, Baker, KGB. so that was a KGB opposite to the one which was making trouble, all the history of the Soviet Union. And I have to tell you a secret, that they are still there. That's why I am not.
Talking about the KGB, you have questions on your chair, so please write your questions and give them to our interns who will be coming around. They won't be vetted by the KGB, your questions. You say in your book that the transition from the presidency of George Herbert Walker Bush and to the, as you put it, the domestically focused Bill Clinton dealt an unexpected blow to the democracy movement in Moscow. What were the major differences between working with the Bush 41 administration and the Clinton administration?
Oh, the Bush 41 himself, he had fantastic and deep and vast knowledge of international relations because of his biography, which I would not dwell upon, but everybody knows. And he had a dream team, I think, like Scowcroft, Jim Baker, and others. It was quite a privilege to work with all of them. And actually, Jim Baker was my best partner ever, not only in America, but elsewhere. Though, for instance, Genscher was very good, very wise guy, and some others, but nothing to compare. And of course, the role of America. They kind of were very helpful and understanding. They understood exactly our problem, that there are dark forces still, exercising pressure, and that we had to continue internal revolution, so to say, or internal change to be able to provide for the foreign policy which I tried to wage. So the foreign policy was very closely interrelated with democratic domestic change. Mm-hmm. But the Clinton administration, they were helpful, of course, and friendly, but I don't believe they had this inner understanding, this feeling that we were still in a revolutionary process, that we needed help to deliver both domestically and in foreign policy. I had a feeling all the time that for them, it was like Warren Christopher became my counterpart. For them, we were just another troublesome friend, you know, but they took it almost for granted that we were friendly, that Russia became friendly. And that made a fundamental difference in many small things and big things, you know, because they took us more or less like France. You know, France is, of course, a long-standing ally and friend. There is no question about that, neither at that time nor today. But French, you know, they usually make, because they have that French grandeur and everything. And even today, this guy in Paris tries to, you know, one way or the other, install his independence and his different view on everything, you know. So they are great people. I love France. I love Paris, and the frog legs is something fantastic food, probably almost as good as a hamburger. But anyway, so they took us more or less like French, you know. Right. But we were not. You were not. Not yet. Yes. We wanted to be there, but not.
Right. Well, Tolstoy wrote in French too, so.
Oh yeah, Tolstoy. You know, being Russian, I had difficulty. I still would have difficulty to read War and Peace, believe it or not, because it's partly written in French. And the first pages, like 20, 30 opening pages, are in French. And it is not dialogues or something. It's just, for him, it was all the same, French and Russian. So you have to read the footnote translation in being Russian in order to read War and Peace.
Exactly. In terms of the conduct of your relations with the Bush 41 administration and Clinton, what I infer from your remarks is that you had a real strategic dialogue with the Bush 41 administration.
Definitely.
But you didn't have that type of strategic dialogue with the Clinton administration.
Yeah, it was called that way, but not as.
But it wasn't really
not as strategic
yes.
as we needed. Yeah, but it would be totally unfair to blame America, including the Clinton administration, on our failure. It was our failure. We owned the failure. We were unable to change things fundamentally in Russia. Russia today, even though it backtracked considerably, but it's a different country in a sense from the Soviet Union. But some features came back. We never dismantled. Like I said, the KGB, it was never fundamentally reformed. It was like, you know, something, organizational changes and other things that we attempted it, but we failed to produce totally different. So the difference between the FBI and the KGB was and remained from the Soviet time and still is that KGB is a deep state.
Yes.
While FBI, I mean, it's ridiculous, of course not.
In a more...
I live here already 10 years and I can't...
As a former foreign minister of Russia, how would you characterize the goals and priorities of Russia's current foreign policy? Would you agree, many commentators say this, that Putin is playing a relatively weak hand very skillfully on the world stage?
Absolutely, yeah. The Putin's strength, to a large extent, probably to the most, is the weakness of American policy and the Western policy, actually. towards Russia. So that's why in my book, I recall that my diplomatic career in the Soviet Union was on its high when President Reagan was in America in power. And despite he was criticized for that when he started actually his tenure, saying that the Soviet Union was an evil empire.
Yes.
And then made other things like the IMF treaty, first deployed the medium-size range nuclear weapons in Europe, despite peace demonstrations, peace rallies there. That was all correct because those people, unfortunately, neither at that time nor today, they don't understand other language, really understand. Though Lavrov was my deputy at that time, I appointed him deputy, Sergei Lavrov, who is now foreign minister, and Jim probably remembers him. He was very good. He is good diplomat. So they are talking fantastic, and it's fine, world-class diplomacy. But for real understanding, they hear, but to make them heed what you are trying to say, you need to tell it from the position of strength.
Exactly. But do you think that Putin has elaborated a worldview on Russia's foreign policy goals, or is it because I know there's I'd like to comment and bring up the so-called Gerasimov doctrine. Some analysis have said that the Gerasimov doctrine is the touchstone of Russia's foreign policy. This philosophy, the Gerasimov philosophy, argues that Russia should have primacy in the near abroad and work toward a multipolar world, in turn avoiding a unipolar world that would be dominated by the United States. And that should be the major goal of Russian diplomacy. That would give Russia more room to play in and exert its influence. So my question is, do you believe that this doctrine still guides Russian policy making, if it ever did, and do you have examples of how it's played out in the real world?
You know, again, if you look into the core of that, this idea of so-called multipolar world is just on one hand, it's just reflection of the reality. It is multipolar world. So arguing and fighting for a multipolar world, it's like looming through this door, which is open. It's just reality. Despite America is still leading power and the only superpower, but it is multipolar world. But when they fight for that, when they make it a slogan, that's just it's just a demagoguery, you know? It's just a substitute for a world-class struggle. The Soviet Union waved the red flag of the world-class struggle, but behind that was just the communist dictatorship, which was by definition hostile to the West, especially to the West, because the West is a democracy. And Russian people, again, the Tolstoy, I mean, it's not by accident that Tolstoy wrote in French, because Russian people, by culture, Russian culture, which is very much formed even by Tolstoy, it's European culture. You know, when Russians think of other people like us, like Russians, they don't think, with all due respect, about Africa or about Iran or about China, because those are different, really different people and really different, you might say, civilizations, like culturally it's different. But they think of France, they think of Europe, for that matter, about the United States of America, because at least because it speaks European language, you know, the English. So for all that reasons, for Russia, the Western democracy is something to emulate. Russian people look at the West for centuries, and the question they ask themselves is why we are European nation, but why don't we live like Europeans, especially last 50, 60 years when Europe enjoys peace, democracy, prosperity, and is in alliance with the United States, which also the democracy, prosperity, and everything, I mean, basically. So that's the problem for the Russian rulers. If they deny democracy for their people, for Russian people, like the Soviets did and like today, then the only image, the only idea that there are people like us, but living much better in democratic country. You know, Putin is in power already 20 years. And during those 20 years, there were 3 American administrations. So Russians are not stupid. They ask themselves why we have the one and only leader, even if he is a chosen one. Nevertheless, he should be open to re-election, to scrutiny, you know, to be accountable. So that's the problem. That was the problem for the Soviet Union. That's why the Soviet Union was in Cold War. I was foreign minister of Russia. I worked in and made very good career, actually, in the Soviet foreign ministry. There is no real problem between Russia and America. We don't have any territorial claims to each other. We are compatible. I mean, it's more or less same culture, people, and economically, Russia is interested in learning the Western standards, the American. I was then, when I was in business, I was once on the board of an American corporation, a pharmaceutical corporation, and everyone in Russia was happy that they invested, and I helped to invest in Russia, because investment meant not only money, but it meant, first of all, the technology, the know-how, which you export from. And that's why China is making this leap forward, because they use Western technology, sometimes steel, but nevertheless, I mean, yeah, sometimes. Yes. I mean, that's natural. I mean, it's a little bit exaggerated that they are so bad people stealing everything. No, they are not stealing everything, but sometimes, you know, it's almost irresistible. You know, if you see an Apple, but they steal from each other. You know, Apple, for instance, or Facebook, they are constantly in courts against other American corporations and Japanese corporations, because that's natural, you know. It's very difficult. If you see a formula which can help you and you take it from the other company, you might call it stealing, you might call it learning, you know. So it's many of those things are semantical. But so Russia must learn or steal American know-how, American technologies, and everything, just like China. That means to be friendly. Why not? So there is no objective, so to say, objective reason for confrontation between Russia and the United States. Much different from China, for instance. Even if China tomorrow becomes democratic and Russia becomes democratic still, those two democratic countries, they would still have a tension because China is giant population just overhanging a large land border with empty Siberia, more or less. You know, no comparison in population density in China and in Siberia, and Siberia is a rich place. So even if you are the most benign, again, you know, stealing or whatever, using the resources, but you will think of it, right, on the Chinese side, even if you are the best of, you know, people there, you still think, why won't we try to use some of that when they are not? They just cannot, Russians, because it's vast territory and very low, dense Russian population there. So it's objective. That's what I call physical kind of source or objective source of tension. But we don't have it with America. Who in America, I mean, Alaska, they want to go to Siberia? I don't think so, right? Alaska is full of resources itself, you know. So, I mean, there is no reason for Russian-American confrontation or any kind of bad relations, except for ideological difference.
How would you characterize, I know this is very difficult to do, but how would you characterize Russian, if we can talk about Russian, thank you, Russian popular opinion about the United States? Is it positive? Is it negative? Is it?
It was positive in our time at the beginning.
Yes.
Then it started to change because of propaganda. The KGB, the military-industrial complex, at that time, even in 92, 93, they still had a lot of industrial base. It was not easy. It takes special effort. That's one of the challenges we faced. Apart from the KGB, we had the problem of transforming the military base, which was mostly 70%, 80% probably of the Soviet industrial might was just military production, military oriented industries. So they were still there. And thus, they still controlled a lot of resources and a lot of money. And they were able, and they had structures. We had nothing. We came from nowhere, in a sense. We just had popular support at the beginning. But we wanted to transform all that. They had the base, the industrial base, which we wanted to change. So they fought back against us, but they had much more power internally. And they paid so-called think tanks, you know, most of the people from the central, the Communist Party Central Committee. Some of them were quite professional, knowledgeable guys. There was a so-called foreign department of the Communist Party Central Committee. It was like the foreign ministry. And some of them had, they knew languages, they knew a lot, and including about the United States and everything. And I tried to recruit some of them to my ministry, because the Communist Party was even banned by our government for a time being, and they were unemployed. I thought that they would be eager to come and to help, you know, because some of them, I knew them. And they did not. Almost nobody came to my ministry from the Foreign Policy Department of the Communist Party. So I was surprised. Despite some of them, I invited myself because I knew them before personally. And then I learned that they went to some kind of mushrooming think tanks. Who paid for those think tanks? You know, some of those think tanks, even today in Russia, like United States Institute or what's the name now? Now it's called Primakov Institute. Those were paid in the Soviet Union by state organizations. And they are today's state organizations, mostly propaganda. But those new mushrooming think tanks, they were completely, they came kind of from nowhere, and they were completely new, and of course, our government did not pay for them, you know, so who paid for them? Those guys who had money still. We had no money because the oil price was very, very low at that time. So we did not have this windfall of the petrodollars like Putin, for instance, enjoys all the time there. So that created tremendous difficulty.
They didn't pay for the Baker Institute either.
And no, I know, but they, I
no,
think.
I'm joking. I mean,
But I think they have a way to influence, probably also financially, some of institutions in the United States.
I'd like to turn to NATO.
Even today.
You write how your position on NATO, opposing its rushed enlargement, as you put it in your book, but being open to joining the Partnership for Peace, was at odds with the hardliners that you had to deal with, who wanted nothing to do with NATO whatsoever and wanted assurances that it would not expand. So what is your opinion on NATO vis-a-vis Russia today?
Today?
Yeah, today.
Today, as in the Soviet time, you know, NATO was never an enemy of the Russian people. To the contrary, when I was foreign minister, we just discussed it at this private setting. There were two attempts in the 20th century, but probably in the whole history, to establish democracy in Russia. One was in 1917, a very short period, so-called transitional government, and then in our time. The transitional government was quite effective, actually, in many aspects, but their main problem was the war on the western borders of the Russian Empire at that time. That was World War I, and Russia was defeated, actually, in a sense of internal organization and management and in terms of economy. So the Russian army was dispersing, and they were coming back, and they wanted peace by all means, you know. But the government understood, I mean, the provisional government, they understood that that was the claim of the population. But on the other hand, they were bound by their responsibility towards allies, and they didn't want to see that Russia was totally defeated, like Bolsheviks later did.
Right.
Bolsheviks tolerated large part of European Russia to be occupied by German forces, but they proclaimed peace. So the provisional government, its back was cracked by the war on the western side of Russia, on the western borders, while we had opposite scenario. On our western borders, we had NATO, which guaranteed security. In that sense, I was completely convinced, and many people there, no general in Russia, neither at that time, nor today, actually believes that there is a military threat from NATO. Because NATO are peaceful countries, sometimes even too peaceful. You can see it in the Middle East, you know, they want America to be there, especially militarily, not themselves. And imagine those countries, you know, those people from Europe, to go to Russia, nuclear superpower, and to repeat the mistakes by Napoleon and Hitler, you know, going there and be defeated definitely inside, if not by armed forces, but then by the General Frost at certain time. So, I mean, I think everybody learned the lesson. So we don't need even, I mean, Russia does not need even border patrols, not to speak of the military force, on the western borders, especially now when other eastern countries joined NATO. NATO guarantees security, at least military security, and to a large extent, even police kind of situation. It's much safer still there. So NATO is no menace to Russia, except that it was and it still is the last line of presenting the West as an enemy. They need the enemy image, as I told you, to explain to their own people, to Russian people, why they are not free like guys on the other side, because there is an enemy, and they need real formidable enemy to justify their omnipotence inside. I tried to substitute the West for them, for the hardline military and even KGB. I tried to substitute the West. I said, no, we don't worry, we need you. We have enemies. We have international terrorists. We have Iran. At that time, it was Saddam Hussein who was suspected. We suspected him too of having ambitions, at least, if not nuclear weapons. And he used actually chemical weapons. So that's quite a threat, right? Even China, to some extent, though I don't believe that China will attack Russia, but nevertheless. So there are some rogue regimes on the Russian southern part. And some of them said, oh, that's good. That gives us, they need to do something, like nuclear scientists. They needed something new to do. But then they realized that it can't be sold to Russian people like an enemy that justifies them to be in power. It justifies them to be useful for Russian security, and that's true. But Iran is no match, you know, or whatever, Taliban is no match. It's annoying, it's deadly force and but that's so local. What really makes it sound, good, sound like, yes, we have to mobilize, forget about freedom, give it all to them because you have formidable enemy, the large enemy, the respected enemy, the United States. Here you are.
We have several questions drawing on that from the audience on Russia's Middle East policy in Syria. Several years ago, we had Secretary Kissinger here, and he mentioned that in one of his earliest meetings with Putin, the major takeaway he took was that Putin really emphasized as a priority the Islamic threat to the Russian Federation. How do you interpret that, his Islamic radicalism and terrorism? Is this a motivating force of Putin's policies in the Middle East and Syria?
There is very simple test to that. Why they are spending huge money. The most of the money they spend on the military are to supersonic weapons now, to strategic nuclear weapons, to the army which could fight the war, at least theoretically could fight the war against NATO again. The military doctrine is against NATO. The answer is because those are Muslim countries. The NATO, they are all Muslim countries, right? That's the Muslim threat to Russia. Like United States, look at the United States. It is extremist Muslim state, right? Just like, but Iran is not. So that's the answer. Why is he obsessed if he really thinks that the danger to Russia, the threat to Russia comes from Islam? Mm-hmm. Why NATO? It's Iran there. There is, Pakistan, there are Taliban. So that's nonsense. And in the Middle East, Islam, the Soviet Union was the patron of his father, of the Assad father, right? I met Assad father and had privilege to ask him to pay a debt because we inherited debt from him. And our idea was to get at least some of that, discounted, but some of that. But the debt was created by the weapon. And the Soviet Union was not against Muslim. Nobody at that time even thought of Muslim threat, right? Not even Muslim terrorism. Muslim terrorism was against Israel mostly, right. But not even Paris or everything. It was channeled. So the Soviet Union gave weapons to the father because it was dictatorship, standing against Israel, threatening the Middle East, destabilizing the Middle East, and against so-called American imperialism. Mm-hmm. So that's the same motive, and that's why they support now his son. Same story. It's more like global anti-Western, anti-American strategy than anything else. And in Russia, it's different type of Muslims. I know. Recently in Moscow, they showed my picture at the Muslim Congress. There was a Muslim Congress of Muslims of Russia. And they, despite, I am not particularly liked by the Kremlin, but they, despite of that, at their Congress, they showed the billboard with me making an address to that Congress when they were formed after the Soviet Union. And I was there as a member of the new government, welcoming them. Because they are mostly peaceful, they are different, only in Caucasus. But again, those guys in Caucasus, they are different breed, so to say. Only Chechens, yeah, they are the same breed as they became, actually, because of indoctrination and because Saudi Arabia, I mean, government or not government, I don't know, but they are paying for that. They kind of converted them to that, to their extremist, version of Muslim faith. But other people in the Soviet Union, in former republics in Asia, they are Sunni, and they are very, very moderate, very moderate.
We have only time. One last question from the audience. Can you talk about how you see the evolution of U.S. sanctions against the Russian Federation because of Ukraine and
sanctions?
Crimea? Sanctions, yes.
Well, there was, I like basically the Obama administration, but their response to that aggression in Crimea first, and then to, it was very feeble.
Feeble.
Very feeble. Had it been stronger, that's when I missed President Reagan, actually. Had it been stronger, the response, probably even the war in eastern Ukraine could have been stopped.
Could have been stopped.
But it was so feeble that he felt like he can get away from all that. And still, the sanctions are there, they are biting. But again, my idea is if you fight, you fight. And you fight with your fist, right? Otherwise, you don't fight. So the choice is either you don't do nothing, which would be wrong choice. But if you do something, I mean, if you want to impress your enemy or whatever, you do it, like incredible way. But making this kind of, there are sanctions, they are biting, but they are like lap dog, not like a real dog. So, you might be scared by the lap dog, you might not. I mean, is it comfortable to have a lap dog all the time on your laps? Probably not.
No.
But not because it could bite, because it could pee.
On that note, please join me in thanking the Foreign Minister for being with us today. It was wonderful. That's bravo. Very well. Very well. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.